This is lecture 2 for topic 1, and in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the informal criminal justice process. So, as we know from the last lecture, many see the criminal justice process as an assembly line of 15 steps, and that offenders go through each of these steps. And Herbert Packer, an expert in the study of justice, he's the one who came up with this idea of the assembly line conveyor belt, which you have this sort of moves an endless stream of cases through the process, and each person along the step does their job to the fullest, and they never stop until the case is closed. But as we know in reality, that this rarely happens, and that this isn't in reality the way that the criminal justice system and process works. And so the assembly line is known as the formal process, but that what we're going to be talking about in this lecture is the informal criminal justice process. Uh, so first, we're going to take a look at a visualization of the winnowing effect. Very few offenders go through all the steps, and that means that we have many at the top and very few at the bottom, so that the process, this informal process, kind of takes on the shape of a funnel. And then we're going to be looking at why there is this funneling, what contributes to the criminal justice funnel. So we're going to look at two concepts. The first one is the courtroom work group, and the second one is the wedding cake model of justice. So let's go ahead and get started. So here's the visualization of the criminal justice funnel. Now, let me first note that there is a different image that is used in the current edition of your textbook. The image in your textbook and this image is based on the same scholarly work, based on taking a look at defendants in large urban counties, based on Bureau of Justice statistics. And so both of the images rely on the same work. I use this image because I think it does a better job of basically showing the funneling or the winnowing effect. Okay. And so at the very top, that you see that they basically, look at all of these crimes that took place in the 75 largest counties in the United States. And as you'll learn next week, or in a couple of weeks, that crime is more likely to take place in big urban counties. And then they basically were sort of, looked at those crimes, and then they based their report in this funnel on if you had 1,000 serious crimes, what happens to those 1,000 serious crimes. And so, based on their research, that they found that 1,000 serious crimes take place. Only half of those, or 500 of those, are actually reported to the police. Of those 500, the vast majority of those go unsolved, about 400. And so only about 100 of the people are arrested for those 500 crimes. And then, of the 100 arrested, about 65 of the 100 are adults and they're considered for prosecution. 35 are juveniles, and then they will go to the juvenile system. Of the adult cases, about 25 of those cases are dropped, and about 40 of those cases then are accepted for prosecution. Of those 40 cases that are accepted for prosecution, 30 of those people are bound over for trial. 10 jump bail, and you don't see them anymore. So there's a winnowing that takes place there. You might see them in the future. Of the 30 that are bound over for trial, that 27 of those people plead guilty, 2 are found guilty, and 1 is acquitted. And of the 29 that are either plead or found guilty, 20 are incarcerated and 9 are placed on probation. So again, you can look at this in more detail in your textbook, but it shows a good example of how at the top starts large, but over time, the process really winnows it down to just a handful of those 1,000 people that actually committed crimes. So let's think critically about the criminal justice funnel. So you might have noticed on the other slide that it stated that only half of serious crimes are reported to police. And of the half that are reported to police, that many are never cleared. In fact, only 100 out of the 500 are cleared or solved. And what that means, cleared means that law enforcement have identified a perpetrator, and then they then send the perpetrator over to the prosecutor's office for charging. You might have been asking yourself, how do we know if a crime is committed if it's not reported to the police? Well, in the chapter that we're going to be reading, when we read chapter 2 in a week or so, um, chapter 2 takes a look at how much crime we have in the United States and the tools we use to measure crime. One way we know how much crime takes place in the United States is looking at the Uniform Crime Report. And the Uniform Crime Report tells us how many crimes have been reported to police. But there's two other tools that you'll learn about in chapter 2. One is the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the other is self-reports. The Crime Victimization Survey is a nationwide survey that surveys households, and it asks people whether or not they've been a victim of crime. What we find from that survey is that a lot more people are victims of crime than are the crimes that are reported to police. And self-reports are surveys of people asking them if they ever have committed a crime. So we have different tools to get an understanding of actually how much crime is taking place in the United States, whether it's reported to the police or not. Maybe ask yourself, is this a cause for concern? So why are crimes reported and why are sometimes crimes not reported? Have you ever been a victim of a crime and not reported it to the police? And if so, why? What were the factors that you took into consideration? On the so few crimes being actually cleared where a perpetrator is identified, is this a cause for concern? And when we get to our chapter on policing, we're going to be taking a look at some ways that the gap between those crimes that are reported and those that are actually so-called cleared or solved, what are some ways that that gap can be closed? Another thing to think about is that your textbook talks about that there are more than 1 million people that are convicted on felony charges a year. And of those million people, 70% of them are incarcerated. So there are a lot of people that work through the system, and we're going to be reading a whole book about the level of incarceration that we have in the United States. Something to think about, though, is that only 30% of those who are arrested on felony charges are actually ever charged with the crime and thus subject to conviction. And so is that gap a cause for concern? It could be maybe a cause for concern, but on the other hand, if you're arrested for a felony charge, it doesn't necessarily mean that you committed that felony charge. If there's not enough evidence to support that, charging somebody, well, then maybe that is a good thing that person would then funnel out or winnow out of the system. Another thing to think about is that of those who are charged, that the vast majority of them, 90% of those cases, are settled prior to going to trial. In other words, 90% or 9 out of 10 cases result in a plea bargain. And so, again, thinking about this winnowing from arrest to conviction and from charge to trial, are these things that we should be concerned about? These are just ideas to put in your head. We'll be talking about these in more detail and more concrete detail in the future. Okay, let's now move on to take a look at the two factors that influence the funneling or winnowing effect. The first thing we're going to look at is the courtroom work group, and the second thing we'll look at is the wedding cake model of justice. The criminal justice system in general and the courtroom in particular is often portrayed as being adversarial. That you have cops that never give up, that they, work 24/7, never complain about overtime, that prosecutors that doggedly pursue all cases, defense attorneys that are brilliant and able to exonerate their clients. I think that when we think about the fiction of what takes place in the criminal justice system or in the courtroom, that's what's comes to mind. And it's often reinforced, that perspective is often reinforced by common portrayals in movies, like where that image comes from, A Few Good Men, right? Which is, like a good example of this sort of like adversarial process that takes place in the courtroom. but the reality is that the courtroom in the criminal justice system in general is much different than that. In reality, the process is not often adversarial, but rather it is cooperative. That members of the who work in the courtroom, and we'll take a look at this in more detail in a second, that they all share the goal of getting an offender through the process as quickly as possible. That they work in an environment that has a heavy caseload, is overloaded. The worker people who work there are kind of overwhelmed, and they all agree that they just want to get things through the criminal justice system as um, quickly as possible. And this is an image of a public defender, and sort of like all the people that public defender is having to represent in in one day in the courtroom. And so it is, he's not going to stand up and fight in an adversarial way for each of those defendants. One of the things I like about the limited series The Night Of is that people who actually work in the criminal justice system have written about just how accurately the TV series portrays the criminal justice system. That it is sort of these slow wheels of justice. That there's a lot of deal making that goes on. That people are not working to the end of the day to solve the case, but they're trying to get things through as quickly as possible. So let's take a look at what the courtroom work group is, and how the work group works together cooperatively. So the courtroom work group is composed of the people who work in the courtroom, the judge, the prosecuting attorney, and the defense attorney. But there's also other court personnel that work in the that could be considered a part of the courtroom work group, and I'll talk about that in a moment. They all share the goals of avoiding trial, removing delays, and streamlining the process as much as possible. In other words, to get people through the system as quickly as possible. And there's features of the work group that facilitate this goal that your textbook talks about. One thing that your textbook talks about is that the members of the courtroom work group, they have a lot in common. And their backgrounds, they have more in common with each other than they do with the basically, particularly for defense attorneys, the clients that they are working for usually. Oftentimes members of the courtroom work group, they might have gone to law school together. They know each other. They see each other really frequently, because the courtroom is where they work. And so, they kind of know what their personalities are. And because you're working day in and day out, just like any other work group, you're going to begin making decisions that are based on some of the shared norms that people in that group have. And so they have certain shared norms and certain shared assumptions. One of the assumptions is that most offenders are guilty, right? Not all, but that you see a lot of people working their way through the courtroom, and a lot of the people are most likely guilty of what they've been charged with. And so this is one of the assumptions that members of the work group have. There's also a hierarchy of sort of shared norms. And so that, for example, the judge, shares the norms of remove delays, streamline, avoid trial. And so if you have a prosecutor or a defense attorney who is not abiding by that shared goal, right, then they're going to be sort of punished for that. The judge will admonish them. They'll say, "Give me a break. I mean, there's not enough evidence here to go to trial." That there's some pressure that comes down from the judge in order for the defense attorney in particular, to get in line to not try to delay the process. Furthermore, prosecutors have bosses, right? And so most prosecutors are not the head prosecutor in the office. And so they have to listen to what their head prosecutor says. And the head prosecutor is usually remove delays, avoid trials. So even if an individual lower level prosecutor wanted to go to trial, their boss would say no. And you actually, if you watch the night of, you see that sort of happening. The prosecutor actually kind of wants to go to trial, but the boss is saying, no, get this through the system as quickly as possible. Also within prosecutors' office, that prosecutors want to have very, very many victories and very few losses in the courtroom. And that's because oftentimes prosecutors are either looking to move up the ranks to another elected, a higher elected position, whether that's attorney general or serving in the, as a member of Congress, etc. Prosecutors, we see with Kamala Harris, the new vice president, that is her background as a prosecutor and an attorney general. And so that you want more victories. That means you don't want to take cases that you might lose because you want to seek higher office. It's going to look like you're a good prosecutor. And also, many prosecutors want to make more money. And so they're looking for a sweet job in a private firm, and having a victory record is going to look better. The same thing happens, in terms of the hierarchy of shared norms with defense attorneys. Many public defenders work for, public defense, agencies within a state, and the caseload is just so high that there is a move towards avoiding trial as well. Now, there can be some benefits for the courtroom work group. I did want to note that the other court personnel that we have is that there are people that the prosecutor works with that are oftentimes brought into the courtroom. So, for example, coroners within the medical examiner's office are oftentimes testify regarding the cause of death. And so they work a lot with the prosecutor. And if they know that the prosecutor wants to have a certain cause of death, the medical examiner will fall in line and say, I could kind of, the cause of death is indeterminate, and I can kind of determine it towards what the prosecutor wants. Same with detectives and coming to testify. So they can, in a way, make up that courtroom work group as well. There are some benefits. Obviously, the caseload is huge within the United States criminal justice system. And so if, a lot of time was spent on every case, there would be such a backlog of cases that nothing would ever get done. But clearly there are some drawbacks as well with these shared assumptions, and the goal of getting things through as quickly as possible is that there's a group, sort of, since it's not adversarial, there's kind of a group buy-in to bypass the rights of the criminally accused, which can be very dangerous in terms of living in a just and fair society. Another factor that influences and impacts the funneling in the criminal justice system is this thing called the criminal justice wedding cake, developed by Samuel Walker, a historian and a scholar of criminal justice. And, your textbook talks about how he kind of created this visual to describe the informal criminal justice process. And so it's a wedding cake. And if you've ever been to a wedding or you've even ever eaten a cake, oftentimes cakes have tiers. The tier at the top is the smallest, the tiers at the bottom are the largest. And Samuel Walker created this wedding cake to help us visualize the criminal justice system. At the top level is what's known as the level one, tier one, is the celebrated cases. These are cases that get a lot of media attention. Sometimes they're serious, like the O.J. Simpson case, okay, which is homicide. A recent case is Harvey Weinstein. He was a movie producer and he was accused of sexual assault. Basically triggered the Me Too movement. And he got a lot of media attention in ways that other sexual assaulters would not get that kind of media attention. But celebrity cases are not always serious. The recent college scandals where rich celebrities bribed colleges to get their kids in, that got a lot of media coverage. And, Martha Stewart, insider trading, got a lot of media coverage. And so tier one are celebrity cases. Tier two are more serious felonies. Felonies such as homicide, manslaughter, aggravated assault, aggravated sexual assault. Those are tier two. Less of those cases happen, so notice the size of the tier. Tier one, not a lot of cases. Tier two, not a lot of cases, but higher up on the wedding cake. Tier three are going to be less serious felonies, and so uh, assault, but not aggravated assault. Uh, Sexual assault, but of a lower level. It would still be a felony, but it wouldn't maybe use physical force or harm. Burglaries could be felonies, right? And so, but they're sort of less considered less serious by the criminal justice system. And tier three is larger and lower down on the chain. And then tier four are misdemeanors. Misdemeanors are regarded in law as less serious crimes, such as shoplifting, certain kinds of theft, thefts of materials that are not worth a lot, and they usually result in a penalty of less than a year in jail. And so the criminal justice wedding cake tells us a couple of things, and basically what it's telling us is that the tiers at the top get the most attention from the criminal justice system. If you're a celebrated case or a serious felony, the chances of you going through most of the steps of the criminal justice system are high. Okay, you're not going to skip a lot of steps. But as you go lower on the wedding cake, less serious felonies and misdemeanors, those are the cases that are going to get less attention from the criminal justice system. It's more likely that a prosecutor won't charge somebody. If they do charge somebody, it will be for a lesser offense, and they'll try to avoid a trial and even avoid some sort of incarceration. Okay, so the top level gets lots of attention, the lower level doesn't get as much. So, what are some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks or downsides of the, sorry about that, downsides of the criminal justice wedding cake? Oh, well, one benefit is that all members of the courtroom work group kind of buy into this way of approaching different cases. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys will be more adversarial on celebrity cases and serious felony cases. They will get more attention from the criminal justice system. Those lower down will get less attention. And there's some parity of that. I mean, that if you don't want to treat people differently who are guilty or charged with misdemeanors and less serious felonies, you don't want to pay more attention to, let's say, a poorer client or a poorer offender or an offender of color. If there's a buy-in that it doesn't matter how rich you are or the color of your skin is, but if you're a celebrity, you're going to get more attention. If it's a misdemeanor or a less serious felony, you're going to get less attention. There's some parity that can come to that. There's some downsides too, as well. Cases that garner a lot of media attention receive different treatment, and one wonders whether that is fair. Like, why should Martha Stewart get more attention from the criminal justice system, or Harvey Weinstein, for that matter, than other people who commit sexual assault? You could say it's because you want to send a message to the broader community, but it also is kind of based on what the media thinks is important and what the media covers. And that could, maybe not be fair or just in the end. Okay, so that's it for this week. And so we understand the steps in the criminal justice process, and we also know that not all the steps are followed, and what are some of the reasons for that. Next week, we're going to be examining the second half of chapter 1. And so we're going to be looking at the 6 perspectives on criminal justice, such as crime control, the rehabilitation perspective, etc. And then you're going to get an opportunity to apply these perspectives to the different stages in the criminal justice process that we've learned about this week. We're going to be doing that via an online discussion. Okay, thanks a lot for paying attention, and I will talk to you again soon.